communauté qui fait du commerce international basé sur des règles bien définies. C'est un accord qui, une fois ratifié et mis en œuvre, sera avantageux pour les travailleurs canadiens. Ce sera bon pour les entreprises canadiennes. Et ce sera bon pour les familles canadiennes. C'est un accord qui abolit l'incertitude pour nos fabricants, nos manufacturiers et nos investisseurs et améliore les droits des travailleurs. L'accord renforce notre importante relation commerciale avec nos partenaires nord-américains et offre une stabilité et une prévisibilité essentielle aux entreprises et aux travailleurs du Canada. This new trade agreement is good for Canada. It's good for Canadian workers, for Canadian businesses, and for Canadian families. It is the result of Canada acting with resolve at the negotiating table, remaining united at home, and getting the job done. It's worth remembering that when negotiations on this new agreement began more than a year ago, we faced the realistic prospect of widespread disruption to our integrated North American economy. Today, the outcome for Canada is that we have protected more than $2 billion a day in cross-border trade and tariff-free access for more than 70% of Canadian exports. This is why for every Canadian whose livelihood relies on trade, this is important. And really, most of us do rely on trade in one way or another. Our job as a government is to safeguard economic gains and prevent economic threats. And that is what we've done with this modernized agreement. It's a reflection of the Team Canada approach we took throughout the negotiations. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Canadians very, very sincerely for their support and their unity in what has been at times a difficult process. Glad to take your questions now.
Minister, what do you have to say to dairy farmers who are now going to have to provide transparency to the United States that they didn't want to have to provide?
It is the Government of Canada that will reciprocally with the United States be offering some transparency, and I do want to emphasize this is something that Canada and the US have mutually agreed to do. When it comes to supply management, I think it is very important to appreciate where we began. And we began with a very strong US demand that we abolish the system of supply management entirely. This agreement, by contrast, guarantees the continued existence of supply management. We've actually agreed that with the United States for the future. That is a very significant element of the agreement. As part of the agreement, we did agree to a modest increase in market access for the United States. That's something which we agreed and announced on September 30th. It is worth remembering that that increase in market access is comparable to the increase in market access which the Conservatives negotiated during the TPP negotiation.
Was that one of the last sticking points you talked yesterday about?
What do you say to farmers now who are concerned?
En ce qui concerne la gestion d'offres, je pense que c'est très important de se souvenir où on a commencé les négociations. Et on a commencé avec une demande très très forte du côté américain que le Canada doit abolir complètement la gestion d'offres. Au contraire, cet accord qu'on a signé aujourd'hui garantit l'existence dans l'avenir de la gestion d'offres. Et c'est vraiment une réussite pour le Canada. C'est vrai que dans les négociations qui ont fini le 30 septembre, on a donné aux Américains un peu plus d'accès à notre marché. C'est important aussi de se souvenir que cet accès additionnel est absolument au niveau comparable avec l'accès additionnel que les conservateurs ont décidé de donner pendant les négociations du partenariat transpacifique. En ce qui concerne les questions sur la transparence, je veux commencer en soulignant que ce n'est pas une question du accès, qui reste exactement le même qu'on a annoncé le 30 septembre. C'est plus une question technique et une question de transparence et de transparence réciproque. C'est ça.
Was this one of the last sticking points? You talked yesterday about ongoing legal scrub, I's being dotted, T's being crossed. Was dairy one of them? And if not, what were?
Well, let me just say this. This is a vast trade agreement. It is probably the most significant trade agreement in the world in terms of the amount of trade which it regulates. And let's remember, this is a trade agreement that governs $2 billion of trade every single day. So there have been an enormous number of details to confirm, to sort out, to be sure that when we signed today, we absolutely knew what we were signing, and we were signing the right deal for Canada. I want to point out to everyone that the agreement in English and in French is being published today, so Canadians can review it for themselves. We were pleased that ahead of this morning, we were able to secure some changes when it came to the dairy section relative to the agreement that the United States published on September 30th. And we feel these changes are good for Canada and good for the Canadian dairy sector.
To what extent did the character of the U.S. president weigh on the Canadian government in its handling of this negotiation?
So for me, as a minister, my counterparty throughout these negotiations has been Ambassador Lighthizer for the United States and Ildefonso Guajardo for Mexico. And in the course of a very intense, I think it's year and almost 4 months, we have come to work extremely closely together, the three of us. We were chatting beforehand. We were in the wings when our leaders were signing. And we agreed that we've really become friends.
But I'm asking you about Donald Trump and his unpredictable nature. So how did Donald Trump weigh on the Canadian government during the revamped NAFTA process?
Throughout the negotiation, we stuck to the approach which we described at the very beginning of the negotiation, which was that Canada was always going to take a very measured, fact-based approach to putting forward our positions, that Canada was always going to stand absolutely firmly for the national interest, that Canada was going to seek creative compromises where we could find them. I think that is a particular talent of Canadian trade negotiators and diplomats. As the 10th largest economy in the world, it's something we've had to get really good at doing, and I think that was very evident in particular in the rules of origin in the car sector. And we've always been clear that at the end of the day, where necessary, we would always be polite, we would always be fact-based, but we would always stand up for our national interest, and that's what we've done.
Il y a des critiques au Canada qui déplorent le fait que vous ayez signé, même s'il y avait des tarifs sur l'acier et l'aluminium, qui disent que c'est un échec de votre gouvernement d'avoir signé quand même. Qu'est-ce que vous auriez à répondre à ces critiques?
J'ai dit du début, du premier moment quand les États-Unis ont commencé cette discussion sur les tarifs contre l'acier et l'aluminium, utilisant la section 232, j'ai dit, et la position du Canada était de ce moment-là, que c'est un enjeu absolument séparé des négociations sur la modernisation de l'ALENA. Et ce n'est pas seulement une opinion, c'est la réalité, c'est la réalité légale, parce que la section 232, c'est une section qu'on peut utiliser seulement pour des raisons de la sécurité nationale. Ce n'est pas une section qui fait partie des négociations du traité du libre-échange. Et les pouvoirs sur la section 232 ont existé beaucoup avant même la négociation du premier ALENA. Et nous continuons de parler avec nos partenaires américains sur ces tarifs. J'ai parlé beaucoup de fois avec l'ambassadeur Lighthizer cette semaine quand j'étais au Canada et nous avons parlé beaucoup hier. Et je continue d'expliquer que pour le Canada, nous pensons, nous disons, nous sommes convaincus que ces tarifs sont injustes, ils sont illégaux, ils sont vraiment absurdes. Dire que l'aluminium et l'acier canadien peuvent être une menace de la sécurité nationale des États-Unis était toujours absurde. Et même plus absurde après le fait que nous avons réussi à moderniser l'ALENA. Une autre chose concernant la signature aujourd'hui, et c'est que nous avons signé l'accord, mais nous avons aussi signé des lettres bilatérales, incluant une lettre très importante concernant le secteur automobilier canadien. Et cette lettre, qui est entrée en vigueur au moment de signature, cette lettre en force légale maintenant est très importante, bien sûr, pour notre industrie automobile, mais aussi pour l'industrie de l'acier et d'aluminium. Parce que, évidemment, l'industrie canadienne d'acier et d'aluminium dépend beaucoup à beaucoup de clients dans l'industrie automobile. Alors, du point de vue de l'industrie canadienne d'aluminium et de l'acier, le fait qu'on a signé aujourd'hui est très important, c'est une bonne nouvelle. Et ce n'était pas possible de signer la lettre sur les automobiles sans signer l'accord entier. J'ai parlé beaucoup dans les semaines passées avec notre industrie, nos entreprises d'acier et d'aluminium dans presque tout le pays. Et une chose qu'ils m'ont dit était que pour les industries d'acier et d'aluminium, la signature de cette lettre, qui est, je souligne parce que c'est important, la lettre maintenant est en vigueur. Cette protection existe maintenant. Quand j'ai expliqué ça, ils m'ont dit que c'était essentiel pour le Canada de signer aujourd'hui et je suis absolument d'accord avec ce point de vue.
I fully agree with that point of view.
That you see this as two separate tracks, Canada law and so on. But President Trump hasn't hesitated to link these things. What do you say to the critics in Canada who say that by signing with the tariffs still in place, that Canada is giving up some kind of leverage or that it's removing the incentive for the U.S. to get rid of these tariffs?
Well, let me simply say it has actually been a very important and valuable position for Canada from day one to be clear that we do not accept the legality of these tariffs, that we do not accept that they are justified, and we have challenged and are continuing our legal challenges at NAFTA, at the WTO, because we think this is simply wrong. And frankly, we are very confident we're going to win those legal challenges. It is worth pointing out as well that one of the important successes for Canada in this negotiation has been to maintain Chapter 19, our dispute settlement panels inside NAFTA. And those, of course, are very relevant to the Canadian softwood lumber industry, but they are also relevant when it comes to the 232 challenge. It has been a very important and valuable point not to allow these waters to be muddied and not, frankly, to accept that this was a legitimate area for us to include in a negotiation. We think these measures are illegitimate. And that was a very important point to insist on. Now, I accept your, I understand the political premise in your question, Evan, and what I would say to that is now that the deal is negotiated, and not just negotiated, but actually signed with enthusiasm by the U.S. administration, surely any lingering justification the United States might have felt it had, which we have never accepted and will not, surely that fragile premise is now gone to. Because the reality is we have a trade agreement now with the United States, signed by us and Mexico, and our feeling is this is a real renewal and re-endorsement of the importance and the value of our trading relationship by this administration. So now is a great time to resolve this outstanding irritant. It's not complicated from Canada's perspective. We could solve it this afternoon, and all we need to do is both lift our reciprocal tariffs on each other.
Do you believe that
Ambassador Lighthizer, just after you signed, told American journalists that these tariffs on aluminum and steel did a lot of good to the American economy, opening plants, it's creating jobs. So they seem to think it's quite legitimate.
And Canada disagrees with that point of view.
Do you think some of those public statements that they've made linking these issues could help Canada when it brings those cases that you've mentioned in various different fora and tribunals?
I think that is a really interesting point, and I certainly believe that, you know, this is a day of real goodwill when it comes to the economic relationship between Canada and the United States from the highest levels. That seems to me like a good tailwind to have when negotiating about something which is put in place on a national security justification, after all. And I think it's important for us to emphasize, as we do, you know, we have now at an essential macro level sorted out our trading relationship with the United States. The fact that we are very strong international allies is not in question. We are allies in NATO, we are allies in NORAD. And so we're now in a situation where we're able to say, we have signed NAFTA. We are NATO allies, we are NORAD allies. And by the way, our trade in steel and aluminum is balanced and mutually beneficial. Shall we just pause for a minute?
You can't compete with that.
Can I, now that the dog fight seems to have resolved...
I'm not quite finished, Kitty, my answer to this. So
oh, sorry, okay.
Dog fight over.
And let me offer one other argument in favor of lifting the steel and aluminum tariffs, which has been expressed in the first instance by U.S. industries at the ITC hearings about the modernized NAFTA. And that is that in the newly agreed rules of origin for cars, which I think we all heard the President speak about very positively today, one of the requirements is a very high requirement for the use of North American steel. And one of the points which American business was making is it would be pretty odd for the Congress to ratify a trade agreement which, as one of its central new elements, acknowledges the highly integrated car sector, but also steel sector, and yet have national security tariffs remain in place. So there has always been a very powerful economic logic behind the integration of the Canadian and U.S. car industry and steel and aluminum industries. And that argument, that logic, is only strengthened by an agreement which is going to strengthen that integration.
Minister, if I can just really quick.
Just something quick on Ukraine. I understand G7 foreign ministers have talked about the situation there. give us a sense of where that might play out now that leaders are gathering for this G20? Is likely to be on the agenda, and what do you see as some of the next steps so far as President Putin is concerned?
Thank you for that question, David. I was hoping someone would raise it. Canada has indeed this week been very active on the tensions between Ukraine and Russia. We have the presidency of the G7 this year, and we led a G7 foreign minister's statement, which we worked hard to get out today, so that the position of the G7 on this issue would be very clear, and so that it would be clear as leaders go into their meeting that the G7 is united in condemning this Russian aggression, is united in calling for the release of those 24 sailors who are prisoners of war, is united in calling for the vessels to be released, and is united in standing for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I spoke last night with Pavlo Klimkin, the foreign minister, and the prime minister spoke with President Poroshenko. President Poroshenko specifically said he was very glad to have the chance to speak to our prime minister on the eve of the G7 meeting. And I'm not in the room right now, but Canada certainly anticipates that this will be an important issue in those conversations, and Canada will speak, as we have in leading this G7 foreign minister's statement, with a strong voice, and a voice on this issue where we are rightly, I believe, considered to have a real expertise. I did briefly this morning also speak about Ukraine with Secretary Pompeo, and we have been collaborating with all of our G7 partners very much, including the United States, on this statement, which was really important to get out today.
Minister, if I may just ask, a couple of weeks ago, Ambassador...
Katie, je vais répondre, mais c'est bon de répéter en français. Okay.
Just a minute, I'd like to answer this one.
Le Canada, maintenant, cette année, est le leader du G7. Et en tant que leader du G7, le Canada a organisé un communiqué conjoint de tous les ministres des Affaires étrangères du G7 qu'on a publié ce matin sur l'agression de le côté de la Russie contre l'Ukraine. C'est un communiqué fort. C'est un communiqué qui démontre la position unie du G7. Le Canada considère que nous avons considéré que c'était important d'avoir un communiqué du côté de tous les pays du G7 au début de cette réunion très importante de leaders du G20. Je suis très content qu'on a réussi à avoir cette communiqué. Le Premier ministre a parlé hier avec le président Poroshenko. Le président Poroshenko a remercié le Premier ministre pour la position forte et importante du Canada.
Minister, if I could just ask, a couple of weeks ago, David McNaughton did an interview with us where he said Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would not participate in any sort of celebration standing alongside Donald Trump as long as these steel and aluminum tariffs remain in place. So what changed, because that did happen today?
From my perspective and from the Prime Minister's, we have always been clear that we were tracking towards a signing of this agreement today. We were glad to get all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed in order to be able to sign this agreement today. This is an important agreement for Canada, a historic agreement, an agreement that governs 70% of our entire international trade. It's absolutely appropriate for the Prime Minister to be there as our leader and to be the one who signs this historic agreement that he personally has worked so hard for us to conclude.
Do you think you're the G7 host nation still? Do you think they need a communique here because of what happened in Charleroi, but also at the APEC summit, where the communiques either weren't reached or had a lifespan of a couple couple hours.
So this is a meeting of the G20,
yes.
And therefore, while we of course are contributing to the continuing discussion around the G20 communique, we're not the chair of this discussion.
So you don't think they need
We have been really glad to continue actively as the chair of the G7, even after the Charlevoix Leaders Summit. And you have seen, all of you, I hope you have, the strong statements that we've been leading on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the strong statement we came out with today on Ukraine and Russia. So when it comes to our role as the G7, we continue to be very active because, frankly, there are a lot of issues at play in the world where strong statements from the G7 are important and valuable. When it comes to the G20 communique, that's something which we are working on very, very hard. The Prime Minister was briefed on progress this morning. We have great diplomats and negotiators, and they're hard at work. This, however, is not a summit at which we are the chair, and it's not appropriate for us to behave as if we are.
But if they don't get one, that would be 3 summits this year that failed to get one that lasted. What would that say about the very nature of these summits? Wouldn't it be a failure?
As you know, Josh, I am always very mindful of the fact that speculating about hypothetical situations is a really bad idea for a minister to do. So I don't do it. Okay, I think we're done. Guys, thank you very, very much. I think we have to go because I will be late for the other meetings. I'm sorry, but it's nice to see you guys. It's very nice to see you guys.
So Eleanor?